what type of influence, if any, have they had on foreign policy having to do with Iraq, namely the Iraq War? What type of influence have they had on characters like Cheney and Rumsfeld and what they have been doing in Iraq? Thanks.
Okay. This is a question about the lobby in the Iraq War, which is probably the most controversial chapter in the entire book. And needless to say, people in the lobby have gone to great lengths to say that the argument that we make about the lobby's influence and Israel's influence in causing the Iraq War is pure fiction. That's not the case. Let me tell you what our basic argument is. Our argument is that the lobby was a necessary ingredient for making the Iraq War happen. That Israel and the lobby both pushed the United States very hard to go to war against Iraq. But we argue that the lobby by itself could not make the war happen. That the lobby needed President Bush and Vice President Cheney to change their thinking about Iraq before a war could happen. Now let me unpack this in a bit more detail for you because it's a very important story. In early 1998, when President Clinton was still in office, the neoconservatives initiated two very famous letters that called upon President Clinton to use military force to topple Saddam Hussein from power. Many of the most prominent neoconservatives signed either one or both of those letters. Nevertheless, they could not get President Clinton to think seriously about going to war against Iraq. And contrary to what many people think, they could not get either Vice President Cheney or President Bush to think seriously about going to war against Iraq before September 11th. Now, this is not to say that President Clinton, Vice President Cheney, and President Bush weren't looking for ways to topple Saddam. They clearly were, all three of them. But up until September 11th, no president was countenancing going to war against Iraq. Let me say a few words about Vice President Cheney, because it's quite clear that after 9/11, he has become especially aggressive in his thinking about American foreign policy, and therefore many people believe that he was that way during the 1990s, and he was that way before September 11th. It's simply not true. Vice President Cheney was actually the Secretary of Defense in 1991, and he was one of the key decision makers who clearly advocated not going to Baghdad because he then understood that what happened after March 2003 would have happened then. Throughout the 1990s, Vice President Cheney, who of course was not the Vice President then, defended the decision not to go to Baghdad. In fact, when presidential candidate Bush selected Richard Cheney to be his running mate, Bill Kristol, a neoconservative who helped generate those 1998 letters, said that he was sick to his stomach at the thought that Cheney was going to be the vice presidential candidate. Cheney also said in the late 1990s that he thought that the Clinton administration was sanctions happening. He was not terribly enthusiastic about sanctions. So what you have before September 11th is you have a situation where the neoconservatives are pushing very hard for a war against Iraq. And in fact, the neoconservatives are really the only group in the United States that's pushing hard for a war against Iraq. There's huge opposition in the State Department, in the Central Intelligence Agency, and other intelligence organizations, and in the military. Okay? What happens after September 11th is that with some convincing from the neoconservatives who have a ready-made template for dealing with the Middle East, they've been thinking about using military force to reorder the entire region for quite a while now. And of course, they initiated these two letters in 1998. Well, September 11th happens, and both Cheney and Bush have since said that for them it was a cataclysmic event. They're searching around for a new way to think about how to deal with the problem. And again, the neoconservatives have a ready-made template. And Bush and Cheney buy on to the basic logic that they have developed over the previous years. And they get very enthusiastic about going to war against Iraq. But the key point I'm making to you here is that the neoconservatives, which are a core element in the lobby, could not make the war happen by themselves. They needed to get Bush and Cheney, who are obviously not part of the lobby, on board. Now, just to unpack this a bit more, because it's a very important subject, we should talk a bit about Israel. The lobby will often say, when dealing with our argument, that when we say Israel was pushing for this war, that that is incorrect. That Israel wanted to attack Iran, not Iraq. Okay, that's the argument. Israel did not want to go to war against Iraq. They wanted to go to war against Iran. Here's what happened. After September 11th, and after the United States looked like it had won a victory in Afghanistan, this is late 2001, the Bush administration begins to put its gun sights on Iraq. The Israelis catch wind of the fact that we're thinking about attacking Iraq in early 2002. The Israelis send a delegation to Washington to tell the Bush administration that Iraq is not the greatest threat in the region, that Iran is the greatest threat in the region. This is in early 2002, okay? But what happens is that the war party in Washington tells the Israelis that what they don't understand is that we are not going to stop with Iraq. We intend to do Iraq, Iran, and Syria. We are talking, this is the war party, not me, we are talking about regional transformation. And Iraq is just the first station on the train line. And what we plan to do, this is what they tell the Israelis, is float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. And we're going to go in there and whack Iraq, pull out, reload the shotgun, whack Iran, pull out, reload the shotgun, and at this point we don't even have to use the shotgun again because everybody's going to be so scared they're just going to throw their hands up. Okay? So the Israelis say, well, if you're going to do Iraq, and then you're going to do Iran, and then you're going to do Syria, this is wonderful news. So they then push very hard from the spring of 2002, and we document this at great length. They pushed very hard from the spring of 2002 up until we invade on March 19, 2003 to get us to, number one, attack Iraq, and number two, not to forget that when we're done with Iraq, we have to do Iran and Syria. And of course, this is what the war party plans to do. And by the way, some people now tell us that the Israelis warned us that this war was going to go south if we weren't careful, and they told us to be careful about going in there, and some of them even said, don't go in there. That's simply not true. And in fact, if the Israelis had any inkling that we were going to get ourselves into trouble in Iraq, they would have understood that that meant that we weren't free then to do Iran. They thought that Iraq was going to be, to use Kenneth Edelman's rhetoric, a cakewalk. The Israelis thought it was going to be a cakewalk, which is why they thought we would go from Iraq to Iran to Syria, or maybe even from Iraq to Syria to Iran. But the point is, they thought it was going to be easy. They bought the same rhetoric. Many people will say the Israelis have fought so many wars in the Middle East. How can they be so foolish? All I would say to you is look at their behavior during the Lebanon War in the summer of 2006. That's completely consistent with their foolish belief that the United States would win a quick and easy victory in Iraq and be able to march on to Iran. The upshot of this, of course, just to complete this story, is that as a result of this boneheaded strategy that the Bush administration came up with, especially the neoconservatives, and that the Israelis backed, is that we have wrecked Iraq. The United States is stuck there forever, and Iran, and Israel's greatest enemy, is more powerful than ever, and the United States is not in a position where it can use military force against Iran, which was Israel's most cherished goal.